Hey guys, Mrs. Diaz. I'm going to go over some graphing examples. So I'm taking a look at homework 4.3.4. We are graphing. I'm going to try number 8 and then probably number 9. So let me get my tool. Here we go. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is I would suggest making almost like 3 dashed lines like so. The reason you want to do this is it's going to create your maximum and your minimum, and then that middle part of the graph is called the sinusoidal axis. So I know it's been a really long time since we talked about these things, but we got the max, the min, and the sinusoidal axis. The next thing you want to notice is the k value, which UT tends to put at the very front. So the k value is 1, all right, and that represents our sinusoidal axis. The number in front of our trig function, that 3, represents our amplitude. So we go up 3, which is 4. Down 3 would be -2. 1 minus 3 is -2. So now we can figure out the minimum and the maximum, and now we have the sinusoidal axis, of course. And the next thing I would do is I would figure out the period. So for period, that formula is 2 pi divided by b. So you're going to take your 2 pi and divide it by 3, and that's our period. After we find the period, then we need to figure out the tick width. So the tick width is your period divided by 4. So I do 2 pi over 3 divided by 4, which is the same thing as saying 2 pi over 3 times the reciprocal of 4, which is 1/4. And I notice a 2 and a 4 can cancel, so that's going to be pi over 2. Don't forget the 3 times 2, that's going to be 6. Pi over 6. So this represents our tick width. And then you're thinking, okay, well, how does that help us? Well, we need tick marks. We need 5 tick marks. The first tick mark, I'm going to write here. The first tick mark is always our h value. And the h value is pi over 3. Remember, you must do the opposite. So if it's a minus in front, you're going to make it positive, pi over 3. The second tick mark is pi over 3 plus the tick width. So pi over 3 plus pi over 6. Got to get a common denominator. So that makes it 3 pi over 6, which is the same thing as pi over 2. The third tick mark is 3 pi over 6 plus the tick width, pi over 6. So 3 pi over 6 plus 1 pi over 6 is 4 pi over 6, which is the same thing as 2 pi over 3. The fourth tick mark is 4 pi over 6 plus our tick width, pi over 6. That's 5 pi over 6. And last but not least, the fifth tick mark is that 5 pi over 6 plus pi over 6, which is 6 pi over 6. Same thing as pi. Okay, and so here you have it. You have our tick marks. Now I'm going to go ahead, and if you had to figure out where 0 was on this graph, well, 0 is going to be right below 1. There's my x-axis. I'll make my y-axis here. Now I'm going to make my tick marks, which the first tick mark was pi over 3. Then it was pi over 2. Then it's 2 pi over 3. Then 5 pi over 6, and last but not least, pi. Those are my tick marks, and from there, we create the graph. Notice we are doing cosine, so cosine is either top to top or bottom to bottom. In this case, because there is negative, it is going to start at the bottom. So it's going to start here at -2. Make sure you're on the first tick mark, pi over 3. Then it goes to the middle sinusoidal axis, top to 4, down to middle, and then down at the very bottom. And then it creates this curve, which is an example of negative cosine. So that is an example of negative cosine. All right, now there's a lot of steps. I'm pretty sure I also made a video during this unit. So if you want to go back and look at another video, I have plenty of examples there as well. Let's try one more. Why not? I'm going to try number 9. So number 9. Notice on this one, that b value is not divided out. So the b value is divided here. See the parentheses? We have to divide the b value out here. So this is going to be 4 sine. The b value is 2/3. So you have to divide a 2/3. So you're going to do pi over 9 divided by 2/3, which is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal 3/2. Now the 9 and the 3, they do simplify, so that's a 1/3. And it looks like, again, 1 times pi over 3 times 2, 6. Pi over 6. I really like that pi over 6. So there's my pi over 6 instead of the pi over 9. All right, now let's go ahead and make our 3 dashed lines. And I always encourage this. It's not mandatory, but I think it really helps. Okay. Now remember, we're always looking for the k value, and the k value is what's in the very front, like this 1, or this also 1, or -2 in this example. But notice this does not have a k value. There's no plus or minus number. So the k value is 0. Now the amplitude, that's the number in front of sine, that's 4. So we're going to go up 4 and down 4, -4, just like that. The nice thing is, since we have 0 already, that's our x-axis. So this is our x-axis. The next thing I'm going to do is period. So to find the period, that's going to be 2 pi over the b value. So 2 pi over 4 gives us pi over 2. So there's the period. The tick width is the period divided by 4. So the tick width, we're going to have to divide that by 4, which is the same thing as multiplying by 1/4. Should be pi over 8. Right? Because when you multiply by 1/4, you get 2 times 4, which is 8. Pi over 8. So that's our tick width. Now the first tick mark, I'm going to write them over here. The first, the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth tick mark. The first tick mark is our h value, which is right here. This time it's going to be a negative pi over 6. Because you see how it's a positive pi over 6 in the equation, but the h is always the opposite. So it's, negative pi over 6. Now we're going to add negative pi over 6 plus pi over 8. Yeah, let's try that. I'm going to do this over here. Pi over 6 negative plus pi over 8. Got to get a common denominator. They both have 24. So that would be -4 plus 3. So this is going to be -1 pi over 24. So the second tick mark is negative pi over 24. Again, we're going to add the tick width, which is pi over 8. Get a common denominator. I'm going to make that 24 again, make that 3. So that would be 2 pi over 24, 2 pi over 24, which is pi over 12. Again, add the tick width, pi over 8, which we know by now is 3 pi over 24. That's going to give us 5 pi over 24. So that's 5 pi over 24. And then add one more tick width, pi over 8, which is 3 pi over 24. That's 8 pi over 24, which is pi over 3. Yep, right, 8 pi over 24 is pi over 3. And there you have it. We've got our tick marks. So I'm going to go ahead and create a y-axis. I do need, actually I'm going to redo that. Let me undo. How do I undo? There we go. I'm going to make it more like over here because I have 2 in the negatives. So I'm going to start off with negative pi over 6, negative pi over 24. Then I'm going to go to pi over 12, and then 5 pi over 24, and last but not least, pi over 3. There you have it. Let's see. So now what I'm going to do is look at what function I'm talking about, which is sine. It is positive, so we're going to start at the sinusoidal axis. We start here in the middle. We go up, we come back down to the sinusoidal, down to the minimum, and back up to the sinusoidal. And sine looks like this. Pretend I got that right there. There it is. There's one period of sine. So I wanted to show you an example of cosine, an example of sine. You have to remember the period formula, which is 2 pi over b, and the tick width to find all the tick marks. Keep practicing, and hopefully I will see you guys soon.